I never imagined that a quiet afternoon in our sleepy little town in Vermont, where nothing ever really happens, would mark the moment my entire life was turned upside down. When the doorbell rang, I thought it might be the mailman, or maybe our neighbor, Edna, asking for some sugar like she usually does. But instead, I found two police officers standing at my front door, their uniforms crisp, their expressions colder than the December air. One of them asked, "Is Mr. Walter Grant home?" And for a second, I couldn't find the words to answer, because Walter Grant was my father, and he'd passed away just 4 weeks ago in a brutal highway accident. When I finally told them that, their next words stunned me even more. Someone had filed a report accusing him of being involved in a purse snatching. A purse snatching. My father, who had spent most of his life covered in machine grease and building up his little workshop into a real factory, was now being tied to a petty crime like that, posthumously. And even more disturbing, the officer wouldn't tell me who had filed the complaint. Something about it didn't sit right. There was malice in the air, something twisted. I felt it creeping through our house, still thick with grief, still filled with Dad's tools and old boots by the door. I didn't know who was behind the accusation, or why, but I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't let my father be buried a second time, this time by lies. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and I'm in my final year at a state university in Massachusetts, majoring in business administration, though for most of my life, I wasn't sure if that was the path I truly wanted. You see, while some kids grew up dreaming of Wall Street or Silicon Valley, I spent my childhood around the hum of machines and the smell of oil-stained rags, watching my father, Walter Caldwell, run a small machine shop that my grandfather had built from the ground up after the war. Back when I was younger, I thought there was something noble about what he did. I'd sit beside him on quiet evenings as he tinkered with broken gears and rusted motors, his hands blackened but steady, and I would proudly tell my friends that one day I'd be a boss like my dad. But as I got older, and especially during my high school years, that pride slowly gave way to something closer to embarrassment. It wasn't that I didn't love my father. It's just that he was always in those same grimy coveralls, coming home late with his lunch untouched and his back aching. Meanwhile, my classmates' fathers wore suits, drove shiny cars, and talked about quarterly earnings, not broken compressors or late shipments. By the time I turned 20, I'd decided I didn't want any part of that life. I wanted boardrooms, not boiler rooms. While my father still hoped I'd take over Caldwell Manufacturing one day, I secretly applied for internships at tech firms and corporate offices, thinking I could escape the blue-collar shadow I grew up in. And yet, despite my efforts to pull away, there was a strange pull in my chest, a quiet guilt, especially whenever I'd see the way his employees greeted him with respect, or how he'd still stop to fix a neighbor's broken lawnmower without charging a dime. Everything began to shift the day I accompanied him on a weekend supply run to a local industrial supply store in Albany. We were walking through the parking lot when someone behind us called out his name. Turning around, I saw a sharply dressed man in his late 50s, polished shoes, expensive watch, the kind of guy who probably never had grease under his nails a day in his life. His name was Gregory Barnes, and I recognized it immediately. He had gone to high school with my father and had somehow made a name for himself at a multinational electronics firm, headquartered in Chicago. After some polite small talk, Gregory, smirking behind his sunglasses, asked my father if he was still running that little shop on Brighton Street. Before my father could respond, Gregory chuckled and said, Can't believe you're still stuck there. You always said you'd grow it into something big, remember? The way he said it was like he was brushing dust off a failed science project. My father gave a tired smile and simply said he didn't have the head for scaling businesses, but at least the company stayed afloat and supported the families who depended on it. That should have been the end of it. But Gregory wasn't done. Well, not everyone's meant to build empires, he said, clapping my father on the back as if they were still teenagers. Then he turned to me and added, "You must be Ethan. You don't plan on taking over that rust bucket, do you? A guy like you should be aiming higher." I wanted to say something. I wanted to tell him off. But I stayed quiet, unsure if it was out of politeness or shame, or maybe both. My father didn't react much either. He just nodded, said something about finishing our errands, and walked ahead. But I could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders stiffened, how he suddenly had no interest in browsing tools like he usually did. That brief encounter dug its claws deep into my mind. I had always thought of my father's work as humble, maybe even unimpressive, but to see someone else, someone arrogant, someone who clearly had no idea what it meant to build something with your bare hands, mock him so openly, it stirred something in me. Still, it wasn't enough to change my path, at least not yet. I was still chasing a future that looked cleaner, smoother, and more prestigious. Little did I know, that smug encounter in the parking lot was just the beginning. What followed would unravel a bitter history of envy, lies, and betrayal, much deeper than I could have imagined. And when the truth came to light, it would not only force me to see my father in a new light, but it would also make me question everything I thought I wanted for my own life. A few weeks passed after that strange, bitter encounter in the parking lot, and I tried to tuck it away like an old scar, visible but no longer throbbing. Life returned to its familiar rhythm. Classes, part-time shifts at a local bar on Riverbend Street, and weekend calls to check in on my mother. My father, ever the stoic man, didn't bring up Gregory again, and I assumed the incident had bounced off him like so many others before. But deep down, I wasn't convinced. There was a stillness in his voice that hadn't been there before, like a man revisiting a wound he thought had healed. Then came the night I didn't expect, but perhaps should have. Our town had always been tight-knit, and coincidentally, my father's old high school alumni association had decided to host their annual reunion at the very bar where I was working, part-time. I had no say in the matter. Just my luck, I was on shift that night. When I saw his name on the reservation list, etched in shaky pen, among a dozen others, my stomach knotted. I didn't want to be part of whatever nostalgic gathering that might spiral into another ego-stroking contest. When the evening arrived, the bar buzzed with laughter, spilled beer, and the occasional off-key rendition of a high school fight song. I stayed behind the counter, hoping my father wouldn't notice me, but of course he did. He waved me over with that familiar grin, introducing me to the crowd as his son, now a college senior on the verge of bigger things. Most of the group chuckled and raised their glasses, offering tipsy congratulations. But one face stood out from the rest, sober-eyed and sharp-tongued. Gregory Barnes, perched at the far end of the table, like a king surveying his court. "You're Ethan, right?" he said, loud enough to cut through the chatter. "We met a few weeks back. So, tell me, are you really thinking of taking over your dad's little operation? Or has someone with sense steered you toward a real career?" I tried to brush it off with a neutral smile, saying I hadn't made up my mind yet, but his breath, thick with scotch and self-satisfaction, washed over me like a foul reminder. He leaned in, laughing louder than necessary, and said, "Come on, you're too smart for that kind of life. Your dad's place? What do you call it now? A manufacturing firm? Let's be honest, it's barely more than a glorified garage." A few of the other alumni shifted uncomfortably in their seats, their laughter dying down as Gregory continued rambling about his promotion to head of accounting, recounting a career that seemed just a bit too polished, a bit too rehearsed. My father, sitting calmly across from him, didn't flinch. Instead, he gently interrupted to ask how Gregory's department had changed since their last run-in, especially considering he'd mentioned being in external sales not long ago. The question landed like a pebble in still water, small but disruptive. Gregory paused mid-sip, his confidence wavering just slightly before he muttered something about being restructured into a better fit. My father raised an eyebrow, his tone still light but pointed, as he remarked that it was odd, given that the company Gregory worked for had just been acquired by a foreign conglomerate, and from what he'd read, had relocated its accounting functions overseas. A beat of silence followed. Then someone at the table chuckled, followed by a ripple of awkward laughter. Gregory's face twitched into a forced smile as he tried to laugh along, but the damage was done. The mask had cracked. I watched my father, not smug, not triumphant, just quietly grounded, as he gently redirected the conversation, never raising his voice, never showing even a flicker of cruelty. And in that moment, something shifted inside me. This wasn't a man to be pitied for his stained hands and modest workshop. He was a man who carried his truth like armor, who didn't need a suit to command respect. What I didn't realize then was that Gregory hadn't left that night with just bruised pride. He left with a grudge, a festering bitterness, born not from what my father had said, but from how effortlessly he had said it. And like all grudges rooted in insecurity, it wouldn't go quietly. It would come back, louder, sharper, and far more dangerous than I could have predicted. It was on a rainy Tuesday morning, grey skies hanging low over the hills of Essex County, that I got the call no son ever wants to receive. My mother's voice, fragile and breaking, told me there had been an accident. My father had been driving back from a supplier's warehouse 2 towns over when a semi lost control on a slick stretch of road and collided head-on with his truck. The impact was immediate, the damage catastrophic. He never made it to the hospital. That day passed like a fog. One moment I was in class, reviewing case studies on corporate liability. The next, I was packing a bag with trembling hands, trying to remember where I'd put my father's favorite flannel shirt just weeks ago. The funeral was small, understated, just the way he would have wanted, and though the church pews were filled with longtime neighbors, employees, and old friends, nothing anyone said could dull the shock that clung to us like a second skin. I remember staring at his photo on the altar, him in his old work jacket, arms folded in front of the factory, wondering if I'd ever told him how much I respected the life he'd built with his bare hands. A month passed in uneasy silence. My mother, though visibly worn from grief, insisted on showing up at the factory every morning, refusing to let the legacy my father left behind crumble without a fight. I tried to split my time between school and helping out, though everything felt half-hearted, like we were all just going through motions that had lost their purpose. And then, just when I thought the worst had already passed, something happened that rattled me in a way I wasn't prepared for. One afternoon, while I was home alone, catching up on coursework, the doorbell rang. Through the peephole, I saw a police cruiser parked by the curb and a uniformed officer standing stiffly on the porch, his expression unreadable. I opened the door with a cautious, "Afternoon, officer. Can I help you?" He asked if Walter Caldwell was home. The name hit me like a punch to the chest. For a moment, I forgot how to speak. I told him slowly that my father had passed away several weeks ago in a traffic accident, and the officer's brow furrowed, not out of disbelief, but confusion. He paused, checked his notes, then asked if I was certain. That's when he explained, in the most careful and clinical tone imaginable, that someone had filed a report implicating my father in a recent purse-snatching incident that took place in a nearby shopping plaza. The claim was serious enough that they had intended to bring him in for questioning. I stood there stunned, my mouth open, unable to wrap my head around what I was hearing. My father, a thief, a man who gave up weekends to fix his workers' cars for free, who used to shovel our elderly neighbor's driveway after every snowstorm. I asked, rather firmly, who had filed the report, but the officer shook his head and told me it was confidential during the early stages of the investigation. He apologized, offered his condolences once more, and left without providing any more clarity. As the patrol car rolled down the street, I stood there on the porch, frozen, feeling like the air itself had been poisoned. This wasn't just an administrative mistake, it was a calculated strike, a shadowy accusation thrown at a man who couldn't defend himself anymore. And what disturbed me most wasn't the absurdity of the claim, but the timing. Someone waited until after he was gone, when he couldn't speak, couldn't answer, couldn't fight, to smear his name. I didn't have proof then, but something in my gut twisted with recognition. It was the same bitter scent I'd picked up that night at the reunion, the stench of envy, of wounded pride, disguised as superiority. I didn't say his name aloud, but I whispered it to myself like a curse. Gregory. It was a Thursday morning like any other, or at least it should have been. I had arrived early at the factory, hoping to get ahead on some administrative work, though most of my time was spent staring at my father's empty office chair, the air still faintly scented with engine oil and the aftershave he used for years. The workers were already busy on the floor, the rhythmic hum of machines blending with low conversation and the occasional burst of laughter. But that familiar cadence was abruptly shattered by a voice I hadn't expected to hear again. Loud, bitter, and echoing down the hallway like a bad memory forced back to life. It was Gregory Barnes. He stormed into the building with the kind of arrogance that only those consumed by their own lies can carry, his coat flapping like a cape behind him, as if he were some self-declared avenger. He didn't ask to speak in private, didn't wait to be invited, and didn't seem to care that my mother, exhausted from grief but still dignified, was standing nearby. "Where is he?" Gregory shouted, his voice already beginning to draw curious eyes from the factory floor. "I want answers. Walter Caldwell may have fooled people in this town, but he didn't fool me. I know he stole that purse. Don't pretend you're not aware of what your father did." The room seemed to freeze, the clatter of tools and the churn of machines giving way to stunned silence. I took a step forward, my chest tight with a pressure I couldn't quite name. Rage, perhaps, or disbelief that someone would dare come into our family's place of work and fling dirt onto a man who could no longer defend himself. I told him calmly, but firmly, that my father had been dead for over a month when the alleged theft occurred, and that no logical timeline could possibly place him at the scene. I thought, perhaps naively, that such a fact would cause Gregory to stop, to pause, and reflect, but instead he grew louder, more desperate, almost manic in the way he recited vague details of the supposed incident. details that curiously kept shifting every time he repeated them. Around us, the factory workers began gathering, arms crossed and brows furrowed, their collective mood shifting from confusion to quiet outrage. These men and women had known my father for decades. They had worked late nights beside him, seen him cut his own salary to make payroll, watched him shovel the walk after storms without being asked. They didn't need proof of his character. It lived in every bolt he tightened and every paycheck he signed. And then something happened that I'll never forget. A voice rose from the crowd. A technician named Reggie, one of the oldest employees in the shop, stepped forward and said, clear and unwavering, Mr. Caldwell was a man of principle. He walked with his shoulders straight and his head high, even when the economy tanked and the orders dried up. He showed up every single day. So don't come in here spitting lies about a man who's no longer around to answer you, because we'll answer for him. Others began to nod, to speak up, brief, impassioned statements from machinists, office staff, even a young apprentice who had just started a month ago. They didn't shout, didn't insult, but the solidarity in their voices hit harder than any accusation Gregory could throw. For a moment, he looked as if he'd swallowed something sharp. Still, I wasn't done. I stepped closer, lowering my voice so only he could hear. I asked how he could accuse my father of something so baseless, knowing full well he was gone. I reminded him, with deliberate calm, that during the reunion he had been caught lying about his career, boasting of promotions that didn't exist and roles that had been moved overseas years ago. And more importantly, I let him know that I wasn't the only one who had noticed. As his face reddened, another factory worker, unbeknownst to Gregory, pulled out his phone and hit play. A recording echoed through the room, capturing Gregory's voice from moments earlier, repeating the same accusation he had denied making to the police, including timelines that directly contradicted not only public records, but common sense. And just like that, the house of cards collapsed. Gregory tried to talk over the recording, stumbling through excuses, claiming misunderstandings, but no one believed him anymore. I told him, firmly, but without theatrics, that I would be turning the recording over to the police. His last words before storming out of the building were lost beneath the rising hum of machines coming back to life, but the silence he left behind was more powerful than anything he could have said. I watched him retreat with the air of a man who had lost control not only of a situation, but of his own narrative. And as the door shut behind him, I felt, for the first time since my father's passing, not relief, but clarity. The truth, long buried under layers of pettiness and jealousy, had finally clawed its way to the surface. And though my father wasn't there to witness it, the people who mattered had seen it unfold. They had stood up, they had remembered, and they had made sure that his name, Walter Caldwell, would not be spoken with suspicion, but with pride. True to my word, I took the audio recording, along with a detailed written statement from both myself and the employee who had captured it, and submitted everything to the local police station the very next morning. The officers, though initially skeptical about the oddity of the case, listened intently as Gregory's voice filled the room, weaving together lies, shifting timelines, and slander that, when placed side by side with my father's death certificate, painted an irrefutable picture of malice disguised as suspicion. They didn't say much at first, but the tone in the room changed. Something serious had just crossed their desk, and they knew it. Within days, an official investigation was launched. Gregory had, perhaps arrogantly, assumed that no one would question him, that his words held more weight than truth, and that whatever bitterness he carried could be projected without consequence. But reality has a way of humbling even the most self-important. Once the authorities uncovered the falsity of his report and the malicious intent behind it, the charge quickly escalated. From mere false reporting to criminal defamation, obstruction, and filing a fraudulent police complaint. I received a call from the precinct just 1 week later informing me that Gregory Barnes had been taken into custody. The arrest wasn't flashy, and it didn't make the news, but the ripple it sent through our community was felt in quiet conversations at coffee shops, in knowing glances passed between neighbors, and in the way people began to speak of my father again. Not as a victim of accident or accusation, but as a man who had earned his dignity not by shouting it, but by living it. A few days after the arrest, something I hadn't anticipated happened. A woman arrived at our door holding a pale blue box wrapped in cloth and ribbon. She introduced herself as Margaret, Gregory's wife, and though I had never met her before, there was something in her eyes that made me pause. Tiredness, yes, but beneath it, an ache that felt oddly familiar. She apologized, not just on behalf of her husband, but for all the years she had stayed silent as he let his envy and bitterness rot him from the inside out. She told me that ever since the reunion, Gregory had been unraveling, haunted by the memory of being humiliated in front of former classmates, of being caught lying, of watching my father, who had once dated the girl Gregory thought would choose him, stand calm and clear-eyed while he floundered. She said the purse-snatching accusation was the product of that bitterness, that twisted need to strike back, even if it meant striking a ghost. And then, in a voice that cracked but did not break, she said she had filed for divorce. She couldn't, in good conscience, share a home with someone who had tried to ruin the reputation of a dead man for reasons so selfish, so cruel, they barely deserved the word jealousy. She handed me the box and said it belonged to my father. I opened it only after she'd gone, and inside was a photograph, one I didn't even know existed, of my father in his early 20s, working the line with my grandfather, both of them beaming despite the grime on their faces. Tucked behind it was a note in Gregory's handwriting, clearly torn from a spiral pad, with just 2 words, "I'm sorry." I don't know if it was sincere or if it was something Margaret had asked him to write, but the truth is, I didn't need his apology. What mattered wasn't that Gregory had finally fallen. It was that my father's name had risen again, not because I screamed the truth, but because I honored it. Because the people who had worked beside him, who knew the sound of his boots on concrete and the way he whistled under pressure, chose to speak when it mattered. And perhaps most importantly, because the truth, though slow, though sometimes buried beneath lies, had found its voice again. In the months that followed Gregory's arrest and Margaret's quiet visit, the factory slowly began to feel less like a place filled with echoes and more like a living organism again. Imperfect, persistent, and in its own way, proud. My mother, though never the type to fuss, started leaving small notes on my desk in the office. Reminders about suppliers or messages from old clients who had heard what had happened and wanted to express their support. Some dropped by just to shake my hand and tell me, in their own quiet way, that my father mattered, that he had built something real, not just in bricks and bolts, but in people. At first, I didn't know if I was doing the right thing. I had always believed my place was somewhere else, at a firm, maybe in a tall building downtown, working under fluorescent lights and deadlines. But each day, I stepped into that factory. Something shifted. I learned to listen more than I spoke, to rely on the wisdom of people who had been there long before me. Reggie taught me how to troubleshoot the old metal press. Carla showed me how she managed vendor relationships, and even the younger crew, who had once seen me as the boss's kid, started treating me as one of their own. But more than anything, I began to understand who my father really was, not through memory, but through the marks he left behind. There was a rusted wrench in his drawer, engraved with his initials, worn smooth from years of use. There was a break-room fridge he had personally restocked during the 2008 recession, when he couldn't afford bonuses but still wanted the crew to feel cared for. And in a framed letter, tucked behind a dusty bookshelf, I found a thank you note from an employee he had bailed out of a financial crisis, never telling a soul. Everywhere I turned, there were pieces of him, not in statues or slogans, but in gestures, in trust, in loyalty earned the slow way. And so, I made a decision. I wouldn't just run Caldwell Manufacturing. I would grow it, shape it, and carry it forward in a way that honored both the grit it was built on and the vision it never stopped reaching for. I used my degree to restructure outdated operations, expanded our contracts, and modernized our logistics while preserving the hands-on craftsmanship that had always set us apart. Late one evening, after locking up the shop, I found myself alone in my father's old office. I sat at his desk, staring at the photo Margaret had returned. My father and grandfather, arms around each other, grinning beneath a sign that simply read, "If it's broken, we fix it." I spoke aloud, not to the room, but to him. I told him I was sorry I hadn't understood sooner. I told him the grease stains on his shirt were a kind of honor, not a flaw. I told him his dream of expanding this factory, of turning it into something lasting, would not die with him. And as I placed that photo back on the shelf, I didn't feel burdened anymore. I felt entrusted. In the end, Gregory's lies fell apart, but they gave me something I never expected: clarity. They stripped away every illusion I had about what matters, and forced me to look, truly look, at the man I had once thought was too ordinary to admire. My father wasn't perfect, but he was good. And in a world that often rewards flash over substance, that is something worth carrying forward. If you're someone who's ever been underestimated, cast aside, or had your worth questioned by people who never truly knew you, or worse, by those who once claimed to, let this be your reminder. Dignity doesn't need permission. Truth doesn't shout, but it never dies. And legacies, they aren't always written in marble. Sometimes they're passed down in calloused hands, in second chances, and in the quiet strength to rebuild. If this story moved you or reminded you of someone you admire, share it. Someone out there needs to hear it. And if you've ever felt like the underdog, know this: your story isn't over. It's just beginning.